Hi everyone, this is Erica from Gokche Capital. Today is episode 9 of our Gokche Investor series. And today we're wrapping up our end-to-end acquisition process mini-series, and we're going to talk about closing. But just as a quick recap of our last episode, in episode 8, we went over environmental issues, including wetlands, flood zones, protected ecosystems, and endangered species. But before we transfer into the closing process, I just wanted to share a couple additional stories that highlight the importance of due diligence, but also how messy a closing can get at times. So I'll start with a story about a mix-up in ownership. So we received a signed purchase agreement, completed our due diligence. The name on the purchase agreement checked out that the person who had signed the purchase agreement was listed as the owner with the assessor and on the vesting deed. So we set up the closing, sent out the package, and the notary arranged for a closing date and time with our seller. But then our notary called us to let us know that she was at the closing, and it turned out that the person who was going to sign the deed was not the same person as who had signed the purchase agreement. And it turned out that the property was owned by his father, who had passed away, and he had signed the purchase agreement as his father. The property had not gone through probate. It was still in the name, or title was still held by his father. So we had to cancel the closing. The moral of the story here is to be sure to review the closing process with your seller. So in this case, making it clear to our seller that he was not able to sign on behalf of his father. And in this case, this also highlights some of the difficulties with pure email correspondence. So if we'd had a few more phone calls, we probably would have caught this before the closing. And another story, somewhat similar, but we received a signed purchase agreement. The ownership checked out, and we called the seller to set up a closing. Now, in this case, we did go over the closing process with our seller. And our seller let us know that he was actually the son of the owner. He just happened to have the exact same name as his father. So he was wondering if he could sign the deed because he had the exact same name. And again, the father had passed away and the property had not gone through probate. So we did have to tell him that actually we would not be able to close until the property went through probate. So again, moral of the story here is always make sure to thoroughly review the closing process with your seller. And we had learned this lesson and did that this time, so we avoided having an issue at the actual closing table. And yet another story. This one doesn't really have a moral. It just kind of shows how messy closings can get. But we had a signed purchase agreement. We completed our due diligence. We sent out the closing package. And then the seller called us at the closing and told us he had rethought our offer and he wanted 1,000 more. We, of course, had to cancel the closing. And we told him no, we could not change our offer amount. So a few weeks later, he called back and said he changed his mind again and wanted to move forward with the original offer. We told him we could if he was serious, but he would need to pay for the cost of the notary to go back out. So first he accepted, but then a few hours later called back and declined. So again, I don't really know what the moral to the story is, but it just shows that every now and then things get a little messy. All right, and our fourth story, and this is the last one, I promise. Again, we got a signed purchase agreement, and we're completing our due diligence. And this was one of our earlier properties as well. So this is another basic lesson that we learned early on. But the property was owned by two parties. Only one had signed the purchase agreement. At the time, we didn't go back and ask them to request that, or we didn't go back and ask them to get the second owner to sign. But we did send out the deed with both parties included and 2 signature pages. At the closing, the seller called and said he wasn't aware that the second owner had to sign. And in this case, the second owner was actually his estranged ex-wife, who was not contactable. So we had to cancel the closing. Again, this was one of our earlier properties, and I think 2 key lessons we learned from it. 1, always make sure that all owners sign the purchase agreement, and then 2, as I had mentioned before, call the seller and thoroughly go over the closing process before you actually move toward a closing. All right, so today we're moving into the mechanics of closing. And in this presentation, I'll briefly review title closings. I don't think that there's too much that we need to say about a title closing. It's the most common way to close on a property, so I think most people are fairly familiar with how the process works. It's also a process that is fairly straightforward from our standpoint because title company will take care of most everything. The major downside from the perspective of an investor, from our perspective, is of course that title can be very expensive. The price varies, and it also depends on what services you want the company to perform, but it can be upwards of $1,000. And at times, even more importantly, it's time consuming. So it can take up to a month to close if you're working through a title company. And I'll have a story about this later, but the extra time can be a big problem depending on who you're working with and what your seller needs. Of course, the major advantage of a title company, and the reason that it's almost always recommended that you do close through title, is they do, in theory, search for liens and ownership issues, and again, in theory, will flag all of those issues if there are any. So when do we use a title company? And I should preface this by saying, as I like to say in all of these videos, right now I'm just going over our process. I'm not necessarily recommending that you follow this. But we will use a title company in certain situations. So the vast majority of the time, if the purchase price is over $10,000, then yes, we will close through a title company. Also, if it's an infill lot or other type of property that very clearly will likely be built on, we will probably close through title company. And then in certain circumstances, even if those other 2 criteria aren't met, but we really like a particular property and have found in our own title search that there is a complicated chain of title, we may sometimes make the decision to pay the cost for a title search, even on a lower value parcel. And when do we not close through a title company? Again, for properties that are under 10,000, generally we do not close through a title company. And this is a business decision for us, but for the most part, it just is, the cost doesn't make sense at that scale. And also generally these lower value properties are very rural properties where it's somewhat unlikely that anyone will be building on it in the near future. And I just wanted to end with this note on what a title search and title insurance are, just in case anyone out there is not familiar. So two of the services, aside from serving as the closing agent, the two main services that a title company offers is a title search, which basically just means that they run through public records to confirm ownership and check for liens and other issues. And they will also provide title insurance. These two services are usually each have a separate fee. But the insurance is protecting the holder from loss sustained from any defects in title. And so these two services are the main reason why it's usually recommended that you do close, or it's almost always recommended that you close through a title company. When we do not close through a title company, we actually do our own title search, so we go through the public records ourselves. And finally, one last story on title closings. It's a pretty quick story, but we were closing. This was one of the instances where we were closing through a title company. In this case, the title search just took a really long time. I think the title company was backlogged, or they just were not making it a priority. So it took a number of weeks for the title search to come back. And by the time it had come back, our seller basically just started ghosting us. So we lost contact with them and could not get back in touch. So the moral here is sometimes time kills deals, and taking too long to close can mean that you never close. Okay, so what's coming in the next episode? In episode 10, we're going to wrap up this mini-series and go over how we do a closing when we do not have a title company involved. And just a few last things for those of you who are not familiar with us. Our website is gokchecapital.com, and if you haven't seen it, we do have a number of giveaways, so check them out. We have a free land giveaway, a free vacation giveaway, and a free swag giveaway. And now, for a limited time, we are also offering free 15-minute consultation calls. So if you'd like to schedule one of these, send us an email at info@gokchecapital.com. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section or send us an email, and we will respond in our next video. So thank you for listening, and more to come.